There is a sound beneath all other sounds, a kind of humless hum, an unstruck bell. You don't notice it until it's all that's left. And that is why silence unnerves us. It isn't merely the absence of noise, it is the presence of everything we try not to feel. In silence we meet ourselves, no filters, no applause, no echo to affirm we were heard. Just the raw, untended pulse of being. For most of us, it is easier to live in the churn of noise than in that kind of naked presence. We fill our days with sound. The tick of devices, the churn of headlines, the scroll of validation. We keep the volume up because we believe that something outside of us will fill the emptiness within. And in that pursuit, we forget noise is not neutral. It agitates, it distracts, it disguises our power as reaction. There's a kind of fear and stillness that feels almost cellular. The moment the room quiets, something deep within us flinches. We reach, reflexively, for distraction, music, conversation, motion, anything. Why? Because silence doesn't let us hide. It strips the scaffolding of persona and exposes what trembles beneath. That's not peace, not yet. That's confrontation and memory. I once sat in a room with someone I loved deeply. We were mid-argument, voices raised, logic sharpened like knives, and then a long, unspoken pause. Neither of us spoke. 10 seconds, 15, it felt like a chasm. My mind raced to fill the silence with a defense, a question, a plea. But something held, and in that stillness, I saw her, not as the opponent, not as the other, but as a human being caught in the same flood of confusion I was. The silence had disarmed the battle. We hadn't surrendered, we had returned. That moment changed everything. This is the paradox: noise feels powerful, but it is often powerless. It fills space, it demands attention, but it does not transform. It bounces back in echoes, sometimes louder, sometimes distorted, but it never listens. Silence, on the other hand, listens with its whole body, and in that listening, it unravels things that noise cannot touch. There's an old saying in Zen: don't speak unless you can improve upon the silence. It's not a warning, it's an invitation to recognize that silence isn't the space between meaning. It is meaning. It is not the emptiness we avoid. It is the ground from which all truth arises. And yet we've been taught to equate silence with weakness. If you don't speak up, you'll be overrun. If you don't defend, you'll be defeated. The loudest voice wins the room. The boldest opinion takes the stage. But is this power? Or is this performance? Imagine instead a form of presence that doesn't need to proclaim itself. A presence that absorbs rather than reacts. That sees without scrambling to be seen. That doesn't fill the space, but holds it. In Buddhist philosophy, this is where the practice begins. Not with talking, not with fixing, with sitting, with stillness, with breath, with becoming intimate with the internal weather we so often try to outshout. And that intimacy reveals something crucial. We are not the storm, we are the awareness of the storm. The more we resist silence, the more we remain entranced by the chaos. But when we lean into it, not to escape the world, but to meet it differently, we begin to hear life speaking in subtler frequencies. In a noisy world, silence becomes rebellion. Not a passive quietness, but a fierce restraint, a chosen absence, a sharpened edge that cuts through the fog of overstimulation, the sword you never swing, but always carry, the power to let a moment ripen, to wait instead of rush, to hold instead of shout. Why do we fear silence? Because it confronts us with our truest power and asks whether we're ready to bear it. And perhaps that is where the journey must begin, not in mastering silence, but in surrendering to what it reveals. But there is something else, something subtler. Beneath the agitation, beneath the discomfort with silence, there is grief, a kind of quiet mourning for the intimacy we've traded for stimulation. Somewhere along the way, the world convinced us that constant input meant connection, that being online meant being alive, that speaking, always speaking, proved we existed. But underneath the algorithms and applause, many of us feel a hollow ache. Not because silence is too empty, but because we've forgotten how full it truly is. What we call fear of silence is often fear of encounter. The encounter with our unguarded self, with the unresolved, the regret, the longing, the small, bruised truths we've pushed below the surface. Silence doesn't manufacture them. It simply stops distracting us from them. And so we run into business, into commentary, into opinion, into echo chambers so loud we mistake them for belonging. But if you stand long enough in a quiet room, something curious happens. You start to hear what's always been there, the rustle of your own breath, the soft throb of your own heartbeat, the voices that don't shout but ask, gently, persistently, are you here? Are you listening? I remember a Buddhist teacher once saying, the noise of the world is not your enemy, it is your teacher. It shows you where you cling, where you fear, where you still believe that sound equals safety. And perhaps that's the most radical thing about silence, not that it is peaceful, but that it is honest, unforgivingly so. It gives you no script, no prompts, just you in your skin, in your time, without rehearsal. It demands nothing, but it reveals everything. There's a Zen story, a koan, that goes like this. A monk asks the master, "What is the way?" The master replies, "Your ordinary mind is the way." The monk, confused, asks, "Should I direct myself toward it or not?" The master answers, "If you try to direct yourself, you go away from it." What does that mean? It means that striving, grasping, even for enlightenment, is still noise. The way is not elsewhere, it is this breath, this silence, this moment you are tempted to escape. And yet, the moment you stop trying to get somewhere, you realize you've always been there. This is why Buddhist practice begins not with change, but with presence, with awareness so deep it becomes indistinguishable from stillness. A silence not of absence, but of attunement, because silence is not passive, it is precise, it is not empty, it is spacious, it is not weak, it is exacting. In a world where everyone is broadcasting, silence becomes a form of rebellion, of sovereignty, of saying, I do not need to speak to be, I do not need to react to matter, I do not need to fill the space in order to hold it. And this is what terrifies the ego, because ego feeds on control, on proof, on being heard, seen, validated. But silence offers none of that. It offers no identity, only presence. And presence cannot be possessed. It can only be inhabited. That's why silence is not a retreat. It's a return to what was never absent, only drowned out. A return to the wellspring beneath all identity, where selfhood dissolves and only awareness remains. A return to the original room, where the echo falls away and only the bell remains, silent before it rings. This is the silence we fear, and this is the silence we must learn to love. And so we are left with a question that lingers long after the noise fades. What remains when we stop filling the space? In the oldest temples of Japan, there are rooms constructed to honor silence itself. Rooms designed not for speech, but for the listening of what cannot be spoken. They are called kekai, sacred boundaries not of stone, but of stillness. You do not speak there, not because you are forbidden, but because the silence is so alive, so articulate, that words would feel like vandalism. Imagine carrying that kind of room within you, not to escape the world, but to meet it without distortion. This is the invitation silence offers, to become a vessel wide enough to hold contradiction without collapse, to witness emotion without being overtaken by it, to be fully present, yet untouched by the agitation of the moment. When we stop fearing silence, we begin to remember something ancient and still and intimately ours. We remember that power is not the ability to force, but the capacity to hold emotion without reacting, to hold space for others without interruption, to hold a decision in our chest until it settles into clarity. The world may keep roaring, but within you, there can be a temple, and that temple begins with a single, unbroken breath. The world rewards the loud. We are taught, early subtly and with ceremony, that to be powerful is to be heard, that volume is value, that the sharpest voice commands the room. The fastest answer wins the argument, the biggest energy owns the space. And so we learn to project, to perform, to inflate our presence like a balloon in a crowded sky. It doesn't matter if we're certain, only that we sound certain. It doesn't matter if we're wise, only that we're fast. We speak to be seen. We shout so we aren't forgotten. This is the religion of noise. Its altar is everywhere, in corporate boardrooms, political debates, comment sections, even spiritual circles. We amplify to assert, we dominate to defend, and in doing so, we inherit a false equation that presence must equal pressure, that influence must come with interruption, that silence is a void rather than a vessel. But there is something brittle in this kind of power. It cracks easily. It depends on reaction, on echo, on applause. The moment the room goes quiet, it falters. It needs to be fed by validation, by dominance, by noise. Without constant external reinforcement, it begins to shrivel, to panic, to grasp. And this is where Buddhist philosophy becomes not just ancient wisdom, but radical instruction. Because in the teachings of the Dharma, power is not noise, it is awareness. It is not force, it is stillness. It is not control, it is clarity. There's a story of the Buddha, seated in meditation beneath the Bodhi tree. Mara, the demon of illusion, comes to tempt him, taunt him, even threaten him. Each attempt more aggressive than the last. And yet, the Buddha does not speak. He does not fight. He simply touches the earth with one hand, a silent gesture that says, I am here, not to conquer, not to react, but to be. That moment, utterly still, wordless, defeats Mara. This is the shape of a different kind of power. It is not interested in being the loudest. It does not need to win the room. It holds its center so completely that it cannot be moved by chaos. It listens, not passively, but completely. And in listening, it sees what noise obscures, that most things do not need reaction. They need presence. There is a monk saying, if your words are better than silence, speak. If not, remain. This is not silence as suppression. It is silence as discernment, a silence that sees through the performance, a silence that chooses clarity over clamor. Think of the moments in your life when someone truly held space for you, without interrupting, without fixing, without crowding your truth with theirs. It was not their advice that transformed you. It was their presence. Their stillness made you feel real, made you feel safe, made you feel seen. This is not weakness. This is mastery. Because to be silent in a world that screams is not to disappear. It is to become the still point around which others spin. It is to hold the room without having to fill it. It is to wield influence without noise. But this kind of presence cannot be faked. It cannot be performed. It can only emerge from inner steadiness, from the willingness to be still long enough that the ego dissolves, and what remains is not self-expression, but self-awareness, not reaction, but recognition, not the thunder of dominance, but the gravity of being. In the echo chamber, sound bounces endlessly, distorted, amplified, repeated until it means nothing. But in the empty room, in the presence of true stillness, every word matters, every silence matters more. So what kind of room do you carry with you? An echo chamber that demands to be filled, or an empty room that invites revelation? There is a peculiar silence right after a crowd disbands. The laughter trails off, the doors close, the echo fades. And what's left is something rawer than quiet. An exposed interior, as if the sound had been covering something up. We live in a world that's become allergic to that exposure. We're conditioned to mask it with stimulation, to keep our fingers moving, our mouths busy, our opinions loud. We've mistaken performance for participation. We confuse being noticed with being known. And above all, we've inherited this idea that if you're not speaking, you're losing. But what if the opposite were true? What if silence isn't retreat, but strategy? What if restraint isn't fear, but mastery? In the teachings of early Buddhist texts, there's a word upaya, skillful means. It refers not to dogma, but to wisdom in action. It means choosing the most compassionate, most piercingly effective gesture for a particular moment, even if that gesture is no gesture at all, even if it's silence. One of the Buddha's most famous sermons wasn't spoken. He simply held up a flower before a crowd of followers. They waited. He said nothing. They waited more. Only one monk smiled, and that smile became the sermon. This is not metaphor. It is method. In a world trained to believe that impact equals volume, that visibility equals power, silence becomes almost unintelligible. It disrupts the rhythm. It refuses the invitation to perform. It breaks the loop of reaction, and because of that, it commands a different kind of attention. Have you ever watched someone pause before answering a question? Not out of hesitation, but presence. Not a delay, but a depth. That pause carries a weight that shouting never could. It stretches time. It rearranges the air in the room. That pause is not absence, it's dominion. And yet, we're terrified to use it. Because silence doesn't broadcast our cleverness. It doesn't wrap us in approval. It offers no shield of distraction. But what it does offer, when used with intention, is unmistakable clarity. Because in silence, we are forced to see, not just others, but ourselves. We see when we're posturing. We feel the discomfort of uncertainty. We hear the voice underneath the voice, the one that speaks not in argument, but in knowing. There's a kind of power that doesn't need to win. It only needs to remain. Like a candle in a storm, not because it resists the wind, but because it knows how to burn steady. That is the power of silence. And when we wield it, not as a weapon, but as a way, we become immune to the pull of performance, the need to be the loudest, the urge to interrupt, the hunger for validation. We stop playing the game of echoes and start living from the ground of being. True power does not roar, it listens, not passively, not submissively, but with such intensity, such presence, that the noise has no hold. In that listening, we see what noise hides, the truth of things, uncloaked and uncursed. In that stillness, we meet a self that doesn't need to impress or defend or declare. It just is. And from that place, from that quiet, rooted presence, action becomes sharp, clean, and necessary. Not louder, but truer. The world will continue to shout. That is its way. But you do not have to shout back. You can choose another frequency, one that cuts through, one that holds, one that whispers and is still heard. There is a moment, just before the bell rings in a Zen monastery, when everything holds its breath. The students are seated. The room is still. The air is thick with quiet tension. No one moves. No one speaks. The silence is not empty. It is not passive. It is charged, as if the universe is poised on the edge of something invisible and immense. Then, clang, the bell rings, and practice begins. But the practice didn't start with the bell. It started with that silence. That moment is the mirror, and in that mirror, the world that shouts begins to crack. Because for all its noise, our culture is strangely afraid of being fully here. Loudness has become a disguise. The raised voice, the viral comment, the manic opinion feed, it's not confidence, it's armor. And underneath that armor, there is often something softer: fear of irrelevance, of invisibility, of not knowing who we are when we are not performing. We are, in many ways, addicted to our own echo, but echoes cannot lead, they only repeat. And so, when we enter silence, not as escape, but as presence, we do something deeply subversive. We stop echoing, we stop performing, we become ungraspable to the noise around us. This is not silence as withdrawal, it is silence as revolution, like a mountain unmoved by storm, like the eye of a hurricane, like the Buddha seated in stillness as kingdoms rose and fell around him. He didn't outshout Mara, he outsat him. This kind of power does not require charisma or credentials. It cannot be given, and it cannot be taken. It emerges from a presence so complete that it no longer needs to react. It simply is. And in that being, it becomes undeniable. In a world that shouts, silence is not weakness, it is sovereignty. There is a certain kind of room that changes you the moment you step inside, not because of its size or the architecture, or the scent of incense still trailing in the corners, but because of what it does not contain. No commentary, no background music, no rehearsed laughter filling the silence, just stillness, a room without echo. At first, it feels disorienting. You listen for something to anchor yourself and nothing comes back. No affirmation, no resistance, no reaction. Your presence is not confirmed or rejected. It simply is. And for a mind trained to gauge its worth by how loudly the world responds, that emptiness can feel unbearable. But wait, something begins to shift. The agitation starts to slow. You begin to hear not what's missing, but what's always been present beneath the noise. The slow rhythm of your breath, the trembling edge of a thought unspoken, the rawness of simply being where you are, without audience. And in this quiet, a strange truth begins to unfold. It is not the echo that gives you form. It is the stillness that gives you shape. This is the encounter with silence that few expect and fewer are prepared for. In Buddhist practice, this encounter is not an interlude. It is the main gate, a gate you cannot force open, one that opens only when you become still enough to notice it was never closed. The room without echo is not a place outside you. It is a room you carry, a room you've forgotten how to enter. In the Zen tradition, there is a metaphor. The moon is reflected perfectly in still water. Turbulent water cannot reflect. It distorts, blurs, scatters light into confusion. But still water, it shows everything, not just the image, but the vastness behind the image. In the same way, silence becomes the mirror in which we finally see what noise kept hidden. Not just others, but ourselves. And yet this encounter is not always serene. Stillness can feel like exposure. Without the distraction of sound, our inner conflicts rise like sediment stirred from the bottom of a lake. Our doubts speak, our fears whisper, our need to fill the void begins to ache in our fingertips. This is the resistance, but it is also the passage, because silence does not erase discomfort, it reveals it. It unmasks what we had numbed with productivity, drowned in distraction, polished with opinion. And if we stay with it, if we don't run, something sacred happens. The noise inside begins to echo less. The reaction begins to dissolve. And what's left is not absence, but awareness. Presence, not as a goal to achieve, but as something uncovered. A return rather than an arrival. I remember the first time I sat in that kind of silence. Not alone, but with someone else. Neither of us spoke. There was no agenda, no small talk to pad the distance between us. Just breath. Just presence. And in that shared stillness, I realized how rarely we offer each other the gift of unqualified space. How conditioned we are to fill it, to fix, to perform. And how powerful it is, how radically human, to just hold it. To hold each other without echo. There's a line from the Tao Te Ching. 30 spokes share the wheel's hub. It is the center hole that makes it useful. Silence is that hole. It is not the absence of meaning. It is the condition for it. Without it, we are only spokes spinning in friction. With it, we become a vessel, not of control, but of coherence. The room without echo teaches us something noise never could, that not all presence demands expression, and not all connection needs sound. That sometimes, the most powerful thing we can offer, to others and to ourselves, is the willingness to stay, to remain, to listen with the whole body. And from that stillness, action, when it arises, is clean, not hurried, not reactive, just true. A room without echo becomes a self without distortion. Stillness is rarely quiet at first. In fact, the moment we enter it, truly enter it, it can feel deafening. like walking into a cavern and suddenly hearing your own blood. There is no echo to comfort you, no conversation to bounce your thoughts off, no audience to applaud your performance. Just breath and the friction of your own mind against itself. This is where the work begins. It is not glamorous, it is not polished, but it is honest, and honesty, in its purest form, has a peculiar weight, a stillness that presses down on your shoulders, not to burden, but to remind that this is who you are when the noise is gone, not the curated self, not the clever voice, the self before language. Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah once said, "You see the leaves move in the wind, but you don't see the wind. In the same way, you see actions, but not the intention. Stillness is what reveals the wind, the intention, the invisible undercurrent that shapes our choices, our reactivity, our masks. It is a kind of X-ray for the soul, but most of us have built our lives on the architecture of sound. Constant movement, constant affirmation. We are fluent in reaction. We know how to respond, how to counter, how to signal alignment or distance with surgical precision. But to do nothing, to say nothing, to be with what is, without defense or agenda, that is foreign terrain, unmapped, wild, and yet that is precisely where transformation begins. Stillness is not a technique, it is a confrontation, and eventually an invitation to stop performing, to stop fixing, to stop resisting, to allow what is unresolved to remain, without rushing to resolve it. There is a moment in many Buddhist monasteries, usually just before the evening chants, when the hall fills not with sound, but with waiting. No one speaks, no one coughs. The air itself feels alert, not heavy, not tense, but reverent, as if the silence were listening back. This kind of stillness doesn't shrink you, it expands you. Because in the absence of echo, something profound is revealed. You are not what the world mirrors back to you. You are what remains when no one is looking, when no one is responding, when the room gives you nothing, and you still choose to remain. And that is a kind of power the world can neither grant nor take away. There's an old tale about a master and student walking through the forest. The student, eager to understand the mind, asks question after question. The master says nothing. Finally, in frustration, the student exclaims, "Why won't you answer me?" The master stops, points to the trees, and says softly, "Do you hear that?" The student listens. "The forest is answering," the master says. "But you are only listening for your own voice in return." That is the essence of the room without echo. It does not flatter. It does not argue. It does not perform. And so it can teach us something that noisy rooms never could: how to see without distortion, how to listen without expecting to be heard, how to move from the center of being, not the surface of approval. To sit in stillness, truly sit, is to come face to face with the part of you that does not need the world to complete it. It's not easy, but it is sacred, because once you've met that part of yourself, you don't forget it. And when the world begins to roar again, as it always will, you carry something back with you, not a technique, not a rule, but a room within you that doesn't echo but absorbs, that doesn't react but reflects, that doesn't vanish in noise but stays still and sees. And so the question becomes, what do we do with the silence once we've entered it? We don't fill it, we don't analyze it, we don't rush to convert it into insight. We sit, we breathe, we allow. In Zen, this is called shikantaza, just sitting, not meditating for something, not watching the breath to calm the mind, just sitting, just being. It sounds simple, even trivial, but in truth, it's a confrontation with every impulse we've learned to obey, to fix, to achieve, to narrate our lives even as we live them. In the room without echo, you realize how loud your inner monologue has become. It echoes back to you with no sound but full presence. The plans, the judgments, the need to be better, different, more. But over time, the edges soften, the commentary thins, not by force but by surrender. like mist dissolving in morning light. What remains is not a blank void, but a luminous stillness, spacious, anchored, unmoved. And from within that stillness, truth arises, not packaged as a thought, not formed into words, but felt like a knowing, a recognition so whole it doesn't need explanation. The kind of knowing that doesn't shout, but pierces. That is the turning point. The room that once felt empty now becomes sacred. Not because it gave you something, but because it took nothing away. It mirrored you without distortion. It held space without judgment. It became what the world rarely is, enough. When you return to the noise of daily life, and you will, you begin to notice the difference. You feel when you're leaving the room, when you're abandoning your stillness to meet someone else's volume. You begin to see the patterns, the bait of outrage, the seduction of performance, the exhaustion of always reacting. And then, even in the midst of chaos, you remember the room. You close your eyes, and you are home. That is the secret no one tells you. Stillness travels. Silence follows. The room without echo lives not in monasteries or mountaintops, but within the chamber of your own awareness. It cannot be broken, only forgotten, and remembered again. Each time you pause, each time you choose presence over performance, each time you let the noise pass without chasing it. You don't have to silence the world. You only have to stop echoing it. Silence is not blankness. It is not the absence of meaning. It is the unfiltered presence of truth. And when you stay with it long enough, you begin to see it for what it really is, a mirror. Not the kind that flatters or adjusts the light just right. No. Silence is the kind of mirror that shows you exactly what's there. Before story, before spin, before habit edits the image into something more acceptable. It is unnerving, at first, because we've been trained to view ourselves through echoes. What others reflect back to us in praise or criticism, applause or rejection. But those echoes distort. They bend around fear, around expectation, around our need to be someone. In the mirror of silence, that scaffolding collapses. There is no audience, no algorithm, just you. And in that stillness you see, not the polished version, the raw one, the unfinished one, the one that moves beneath the surface of every role you play. It is the sight we avoid with distraction. But it is also the only sight that frees. In Buddhist teachings, there's the image of the moon reflected in water. If the water is turbulent, the image warps. But if the water is still, the moon appears perfectly, unmoved, luminous. This is the self in silence. Not some higher self you have to become, but the one that has always been there, waiting to be seen without ripples. I once sat in a silent retreat where we were instructed not to speak, not to make eye contact, not even to write. At first I felt invisible, then restless, then exposed. My thoughts, unchecked, ran in circles. Memories surfaced. Grudges returned. I watched myself judge and narrate, perform and recall, all in the quiet of my own skull. But something unexpected began to happen. The more I watched without interference, the less attached I became to what I saw. I stopped trying to fix it, or resist it, or frame it in a more flattering light. I just witnessed. And in that witnessing, something softened. Because when silence becomes a mirror, it doesn't just reflect your ego, it reflects the space beneath it. The part of you that is aware of the storm, but not swept away by it. The clarity that's always been there, hidden behind noise. This is not passive awareness, it's a sword, a subtle one, the kind that slices through illusion, not with violence, but with precision. It separates reaction from response, projection from perception, what someone said from what you assumed they meant, what you felt from what was actually true. And this clarity, that arrives only when we stop reacting, is the foundation of inner power, because you can't act cleanly from confusion. You can't move with integrity if you're tangled in defense. But when you see clearly without distortion, even a single word can land like lightning. Even a single pause can reframe a whole conversation. In this way, silence becomes not retreat but readiness, like a blade drawn but not swung, like the space between inhale and exhale, where all decisions are born. There's a phrase in Zen: when the mind is still, the universe surrenders. It doesn't mean you gain control. It means you begin to see, truly see, the nature of things without trying to make them something else, without making yourself something else. And that is perhaps the greatest power of the mirror of silence. Not that it reveals how flawed or chaotic we are, but how much of our struggle comes from not seeing clearly to begin with, how much peace is lost in reaction, how much truth is buried beneath the need to be right. Silence holds that truth patiently. It waits for us to be ready to meet ourselves. Not the image, not the role, not the echo, just the reflection, clear, unmoved, complete. Most people are not afraid of being alone. They're afraid of what rises to the surface when nothing distracts them from themselves. This is what silence does. It removes the filters. It takes away the noise, the approval, the argument, the distraction, and it leaves you standing there, just you, with what is. And that is where the mirror forms, not in glass, but in stillness, in the absence of reaction. The mirror of silence doesn't lie, but it doesn't flatter either. It shows you the face behind the performance, the story beneath the story, the part of you that doesn't speak, doesn't argue, doesn't ask to be liked, only watches. It watches the thoughts come and go. It watches the emotions rise and dissolve. It watches the urge to interrupt, defend, retreat. It sees through it all, and it never moves. This is not passive detachment, it is fierce clarity, like the sky behind a storm, vast, unshaken, utterly present. The mirror of silence reveals not only what we are, but what we are not. We are not the storm. We are not the echo. We are not the noise that tries to define us. We are the space that holds it. There's a practice in Zen monasteries called Gammon. Thus it is, endure. But this endurance is not grim. It's not resignation. It's endurance as seeing. To sit still with what arises without flinching, without narrating, without numbing. And in that sitting, something exquisite happens. Distortion fades. Clarity sharpens. Not the truth of opinion, but the truth of being. It's like watching sediment settle to the bottom of a glass. What was once cloudy becomes transparent, not because you stirred it, but because you waited. And in that transparency, you begin to see others more clearly too, because the mirror of silence doesn't just reflect you. It shows you the shapes around you, unclouded by your projections. You begin to notice when someone speaks from fear, when someone hides in confidence, when noise is just armor. You feel it, not as judgment, but as insight. And this changes everything, because now you're no longer reacting to the surface. You're listening beneath it. Your silence becomes not withdrawal, but attunement. You say less, but you see more. You wait longer, but you understand deeper. This is the superpower, not silence as escape, but silence as revelation. In one of the Buddha's final dialogues, a disciple asked him, "How should we live?" And the Buddha, instead of responding with a doctrine, simply sat in silence. The disciple bowed. He understood, because sometimes the clearest response is the space we leave unfilled. Not everything must be answered. Not every moment must be occupied. Some things resolve simply by being seen. Some conflicts dissolve when no fuel is added to them, and some truths arise only in the absence of striving. So when you feel yourself pulled to fill the space, pause. When your ego scrambles to speak, breathe. When your fear demands certainty, listen instead. Let silence show you what distortion cannot. Let it clean the mirror, not to make you better, but to make you real. There is a strange kind of electricity in the moment, just before you say what you always say. That surge, that reflex, that flash of feeling, it wants out. To defend, to correct, to explain, to prove. And the world, loud and fast and relentless, rewards this quick-fire response. It calls it strength, confidence, relevance. But what if not reacting was actually more powerful? What if withholding wasn't weakness but rebellion? In a world addicted to speed, to spectacle, to reaction, non-reaction is subversive. It interrupts the rhythm of escalation. It disturbs the pattern of conflict. And in that interruption, something deeper has space to emerge. Awareness, nuanced truth. This is not silence as avoidance. This is not passivity. This is restraint as revolution. Imagine it: someone hurls a sharp comment your way. In the past, you'd fire back. Words like arrows, drawn before your breath even caught up. But now you don't. Not because you've lost your voice, but because you've found your center. You allow the words to pass. You breathe once. You see the heat without feeding it. And in that pause, everything shifts. The loop breaks. The echo fades. The space between action and reaction becomes a doorway, not to escape, but to choose. This is non-reaction. And it is a kind of courage that lives in the quiet. Buddhist philosophy teaches this through the idea of opeg, equanimity, but don't mistake it for detachment. It is not about numbing or disengaging. Opeg is fierce. It is the power to stay unmoved, not because you don't care, but because you care enough not to make it worse. It is the strength to see clearly even when provoked, to withhold not out of fear but out of clarity. And that clarity cuts, like a blade, not through others, but through illusion. There's a parable of the Buddha and the angry man. The man comes shouting, trying to provoke. The Buddha says nothing. The man finally demands, "Why don't you answer me?" And the Buddha replies, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" That's not indifference. That's wisdom. That's refusal to be drawn into someone else's storm. And in that refusal, there is power. Because we live in a culture that equates reaction with relevance. If you're silent, it must mean you agree. If you don't respond, it must mean you've lost. But true mastery is not measured by how quickly you clap back. It's measured by how clearly you can see, and how deliberately you choose your moment to act or not act at all. Non-reaction is not inaction. It is action refined to its essence. It is the sword you don't draw, because you see there is no battle worth fighting here. Or better yet, you see the battle was never real. You begin to notice how often people argue to defend not truth, but identity. How often they react to protect the idea of themselves. And how silence, when used not as withdrawal but as awareness, reveals the emptiness beneath that noise. This is the mirror of silence again, but now turned outward. You begin to see people's pain behind their posturing, their fear behind their force, and you no longer need to react, because you're not being attacked. You're being shown someone else's suffering, and you do not need to mirror it. You can absorb it without collapse, witness it without agreement, and respond, not with more noise, but with the stillness that changes everything. This is not about letting people walk over you. This is about not walking into the fire just because someone else is burning. There's a temple bell in Kyoto that only rings once a year. When it does, the entire community falls silent to hear it. The sound doesn't rush, it expands, it doesn't shout, it resonates. Let your silence be like that bell, intentional, clear, unmistakable. It does not need to justify itself. Its presence is the message. So next time the world demands your reaction, pause, breathe, choose. Because in that act of conscious withholding, you are doing something radical. You are stepping out of the loop. You are breaking the spell. You are reclaiming your power from the noise. And in that moment, you do not disappear. You arrive. To withhold is not to retreat. It is to reveal to yourself first, and then to the world, the immense depth that lies just beneath your impulse to respond. Most of us have been taught that reaction is power, that the faster you respond, the sharper your reply, The more dominant your posture, the stronger you are. But the truth, quieter, older, less palatable, is that reaction is rarely power. It is reflex. It is programming. It is the nervous system defending a story the ego doesn't want questioned. Non-reaction breaks that chain. It doesn't just quiet the noise, it severs the pattern. It says, I see what's happening, and I choose not to be swept into it. That choice is not cold. It is not superior. It is sacred. It is the act of a mind that has tasted stillness and remembers how to return to it, even under pressure. The battlefield may be external, a tense conversation, a betrayal, a moment where your dignity feels provoked, or it may be internal, a thought loop, a surge of anger, the old need to correct and control. Either way, silence becomes a shield, not made of steel but of space, a stillness that does not block but absorbs, and in that absorption transforms. There is a story of the Buddha being insulted by a furious man. The man hurls every imaginable word at him, vile, venomous. And when the man finishes, the Buddha smiles and asks, if a person refuses to accept a gift, to whom does it belong? The man is confused. To the one who offered it, he replies, exactly. The Buddha says, so too with your anger. I do not accept it. It remains with you. This is not indifference. It is deep attention, so deep that it sees through the surface of provocation to the suffering that produced it. It sees that to react is to join the illusion, and to withhold is to remain in reality. This is rebellion, not against people, but against the unconscious machinery that runs so much of our lives. To choose non-reaction is to step out of that machine, to pause the cycle, to breathe instead of bite, to let silence speak first. And what does silence say? It says, I am not bound to this. It says this heat is not mine to carry. It says there is strength in not being provoked. And perhaps most powerfully, it says nothing at all. That kind of nothing is not empty. It is full. It is concentrated. It radiates presence. It changes the chemistry of the room. When someone expects your escalation and receives your stillness instead, they feel it, not as defeat, but as disorientation. The expected loop has been cut, and in that cut, clarity seeps in. Sometimes the greatest offering you can make to a situation is not more energy, but less heat, less friction, less I, and that less becomes more, a fertile silence from which right action can grow. This is the essence of the sword you do not draw, because stillness is not passive, it is precise, like a master swordsman who knows when not to strike, who can feel the moment rise and fall and leave it untouched. Because the clearest victory is not winning the fight, it is not needing to enter it at all. Think of the last time someone said something that struck your pride, the last time your gut wanted to fire back. What if, just for a moment, you had waited, let the silence stretch, let the wave pass, not to suppress, but to see. See who you become when you are not defending anything. This is not easy. It is the work of lifetimes, but it is possible, and it begins in one breath. One breath held instead of hurled, one breath deep enough to remember I am not this reaction. I am the one who sees it arise, and in seeing it arise, you begin to know freedom. Because true power doesn't rush in. It watches, it waits, and when it moves like water, like stone, like a truth that does not require approval to be real. That is the rebellion, to reclaim your energy, to honor your presence, to know that silence is not the absence of speech, but the presence of choice. You don't owe the world your reaction, you owe it your clarity. There is a quiet heroism in the moment you decide not to respond. Not because you're withholding out of fear, or because you've run out of things to say, but because you've seen the full arc of the reaction before it even finishes rising. You felt the adrenaline sharpen your tongue. You've heard the comeback load itself onto your breath, and then, from a deeper place, not the mind, not the ego, but somewhere beneath, you choose stillness, not as silence, but as strength. That stillness is not empty, it's charged. It pulses with awareness, it listens without yielding, absorbs without collapsing. It is the moment the sword remains in its sheath, not from weakness, but from wisdom, because it sees that the battle is not worth winning if it costs you your clarity. You begin to sense it in everyday life, the invitations to react, the subtle provocations, the endless tests of your equilibrium. Sometimes they're loud, an insult, a confrontation, a public challenge, but more often they're small. A glance, a dismissive tone, a delay that triggers something old and buried. And in each of those moments there is a fork. You can go the old way, the way of heat and haste and noise, or you can pause, not freeze, not flee, but pause with full presence, to feel the impulse and let it pass, to return to that internal room where nothing needs to be proved. That pause is not nothing, it is everything. Because in that breath, you reclaim authorship over yourself. That's the rebellion. In a society where reactivity is currency, where speed is mistaken for insight, and outrage for courage, the one who can withhold becomes ungovernable by the world's noise. This is the non-reaction that undoes centuries of conditioning. It does not shout. It does not preach. It simply does not feed the fire. And so the fire begins to die. There's a Zen saying, "The bamboo shadows sweep the stairs, but the dust does not move." This is the image of stillness amidst motion, of being so rooted that even when the world brushes against you, you do not lose yourself to its wind. You become the unmoving dust beneath the dance of light. In Buddhist psychology, this quality is not submission, it's virya, or spiritual energy. It is the patient strength to choose presence over drama, restraint over release. It is the fire that burns without smoke. And yes, sometimes it will feel unnatural. It will feel like weakness, especially in the beginning. Because everything you've been taught has told you to win the moment, to hold the last word, to never be the one who lets it go. But letting go is not giving in. It is stepping back so you can see clearly. It is refusing to answer a question designed to trap you. It is leaving the invitation unopened because you know where it leads. And so the room changes. People notice, even if they don't say it. They feel the difference. They sense the power in your stillness, the force in your refusal to bite. And without knowing why, they listen more closely. Because what you're doing is not just resisting noise, you're modeling a new gravity. One that doesn't orbit around attention. One that holds its shape without needing applause. One that chooses when to rise and when to rest. The truth is, most conflict isn't asking to be solved. It's asking to be seen. And the one who sees, without flinching, without feeding, without fleeing, becomes a mirror the moment cannot distort. You become that mirror, clear, unshaken, quiet, but never invisible. So the next time the world offers you its noise, its chaos, its drama, let it echo, and stay where you are. Because presence is louder than reaction, and clarity is the most radical rebellion of all. There is a moment just before you speak, when a doorway opens. It is small, unassuming. You could step over it without noticing. But if you pause, if you linger in that breath before the words take shape, you'll feel it a choice. Not between good and bad, right and wrong, but between reflex and clarity, between being pulled and being poised. This is the doorway of restraint, and it is rarely walked through, because we live in a world that worships immediacy. Say it now, reply instantly, be the first to respond, to post, to clap back. But there is a deeper language, one the noise can't comprehend. It's the language of restraint, of what's not said, of what's withheld on purpose, not because it lacks courage, but because it carries a kind of power too large to be forced into words. That power is often mistaken for passivity, but restraint is not weakness, it is discipline. It is attention sharpened into choice, and when wielded with awareness, it is louder than anything that could be spoken. Think of the moments in your life that left an imprint. not because of what was said, but because of what was felt in silence, a glance held, a breath not filled, a truth hovering in the space between two people, waiting and then passing, unsaid but known. That's not absence, that's presence distilled to its essence. In Buddhist philosophy, this kind of restraint isn't about repression, it's about timing. In Sanskrit, there's the word virga, dispassion, or more precisely, non-attachment to the need to act. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough to wait. You wait until the action arises from clarity, not from compulsion. That pause is where power lives. There's a teaching about a master who always paused before answering any question. Sometimes for seconds, sometimes for what felt like minutes. The students grew restless. They thought maybe he didn't know. But over time, they began to feel the pause itself was the teaching. He wasn't delaying to find the right answer. He was emptying himself of the one that came too fast, because the fastest answer is often the most rehearsed. And the most rehearsed is rarely the most true. So what happens when you choose not to answer? When you let the question hang? When you let the accusation float without chasing it down with a defense? What happens is this: you change the field. The tension that expects response finds no landing place. The pattern of conflict short circuits. The air becomes charged not with resistance, but with something deeper, something uncertain, awake, alive. Because now you're listening, and not just to the other person. You're listening to the space between words, to the wisdom rising from stillness, to the current under the surface of the moment. That's what makes restraint so radical. It turns the volume down on the world and turns the depth up within you. When you withhold, not to control, but to sense, you become dangerous in the most elegant way. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer shaped by the pressure of others' expectations. You are no longer governed by the speed of reaction. You have become sovereign in your silence. This kind of presence changes conversations. It changes relationships. Sometimes it ends arguments before they begin. Other times, it invites others into a depth they didn't know they were seeking. Because your refusal to be rushed becomes permission for truth to enter. Think of restraint as the sharpest edge of silence. The moment it's no longer passive, but precise. It's the moment you realize that saying something isn't always the same as saying something true. And when you speak, if you do, it comes from a different place, a quieter place. Not from the mouth, but from the center, and people feel it. They may not know why, but they lean in. Because what you say carries the weight of what you didn't say, and that weight makes it real. Restraint isn't retreat, it's readiness. It's the silence that holds the sword, not because it needs to strike, but because it already sees through the conflict. So let others rush to fill the space. You sit in it. Let others perform. You breathe. Let others demand a reaction. You choose presence. And when you do speak, the room will know. Because when you've trained yourself to withhold noise, what remains is only signal. A monk once said, "If you cannot improve upon the silence, do not speak." But what if the silence itself is the improvement? There are moments in life when the sharpest response is no response at all. Not from cowardice or indifference, but from a clarity so exact, it no longer needs sound to prove its shape. You've felt it. That tension in a conversation when someone expects your defense, expects you to fight, explain, perform, and instead you remain still, not shut down, not suppressed, just immovably calm, and the room changes. Because silence, when it is inhabited, becomes a kind of mirror. And in that mirror, people see not your reaction, but their own motives reflected back with piercing fidelity. It is here that restraint becomes revelation. This is not easy. Everything in us is trained to answer, to fill the gap. We are taught to defend our name, to justify our choices, to rebut insult with swift articulation. But in Buddhist thought, There is a discipline deeper than eloquence varia, the energetic effort to sustain clarity, not through speaking, but through abstaining. Silence, then, becomes a kind of architecture. It gives structure to chaos. It forces all noise to reckon with its own echo. When you don't react, when you don't fill the air, the assumptions collapse. The aggression withers. The manipulation unravels under its own weight, and what's left is presence, pure, focused, unshakable. There's a story from the life of the Buddha. A man, seething with rage, approaches him and hurls insult after insult. The Buddha remains silent, unmoved. Finally, the man demands, "Are you not going to say anything?" The Buddha gently replies, "If someone offers you a gift, and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" That is restraint, not as repression, but as a force that redirects energy, not returning fire. Letting fire die out in the absence of fuel. And yet, this is a kind of rebellion. A rebellion not of noise, but of refusal. You are refusing to be baited, refusing to join the cycle, refusing to let your truth be dictated by someone else's urgency. And in that refusal, you reclaim yourself, you reclaim your timing, your tone, your terrain. This is not about being passive. It is about being ungovernable by chaos, like a mountain that doesn't tremble in the wind. Stillness here does not mean stuck, it means sovereign. In high-stakes moments, confrontations, negotiations, heartbreaks, when you choose silence, you create a vacuum. Into that vacuum, truth rushes in, or sometimes, lies collapse under their own volume. In either case, something honest is revealed. Try it. The next time someone hurls a challenge meant to hook you, just wait. One breath longer than is comfortable. Let the silence rise like mist between you. Feel the discomfort, yours and theirs. Listen. Not to their words, to what's underneath them. The insecurity, the need, the distortion. And then decide, does this require speech? Or has the silence already said it all? There is artistry in restraint. The warrior knows not every sword must leave its sheath. The teacher knows not every truth must be explained. The lover knows not every feeling must be named. To say nothing, when everything demands you to speak, is to master the moment. Because when your words are rare, they resound. Because when your presence is full, it speaks louder than language. And because when you are silent by choice, not fear, you become untouchable. So hold your fire, still your tongue, let the others talk. You listen like a monk listens to a mountain. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is absolutely nothing. They say the sharpest sword is the one never drawn. But what if that sword is not forged in steel, but in stillness? There comes a moment, subtle, silent, when the room is vibrating with tension. Words are rising, egos inflating. Lines are being drawn, sharpened with emotion. It is in this crucible, where reaction seems natural, almost inevitable, that a single act, undramatic and invisible, slices clean through the noise. You do not move, you do not speak, you see. Stillness, in that moment, becomes a blade, not to wound, but to reveal. It severs illusion. It cuts through the fog of reactivity, the swarm of projections, the debris of assumption. What remains in its wake is clarity. There is a scene in an old Zen parable where two monks argue over a flag fluttering in the wind. One insists the flag is moving. The other says, no, the wind is moving. Their teacher walks by, listens briefly, and replies, it is neither the flag nor the wind. It is your mind that moves. Stillness does not just mean physical quiet. It is the power to not be carried away, to become the unmoving center while the storm spins outward. It is the discipline of not taking the bait. The sword you do not draw is the mind you do not let be dragged. This does not mean avoidance. It means perception honed to a razor's edge. Think of it, how many arguments have you watched spiral into absurdity? Not because of content, but because no one stopped, no one paused, no one chose stillness. The battle became about winning, not seeing, about proving, not perceiving. But silence, the kind born from centered presence, does not seek to win. It seeks to witness. It watches unmoved until the truth reveals itself. There's an old Buddhist image, a clear lake reflecting the moon. But stir the water, and the moon is shattered into fragments. You cannot grasp it then. Only in stillness can you see what was always there. And so it is in conflict, in confusion, in chaos. Stillness is not weakness, it is precision. It is the warrior who doesn't flinch, the sage who listens longer, the leader who chooses not to react out of habit, but to respond from presence. It is restraint as an act of strength, not fear. In the martial arts, particularly in disciplines like Aikido or Tai Chi, the master does not meet force with force. They move with the aggression, not against it. They use its momentum to neutralize it. But first, they must be still. They must see it fully. Only then can they redirect it. Silence, too, is a form of internal Aikido. You observe, and when you finally act, if you act, it is not reactive, it is exact, it is clean, it is necessary. This is the paradox. Stillness looks passive, but it is the seed of the most potent action, because it comes from choice, not compulsion. In a world that idolizes immediacy, fast takes, hot responses, rapid comebacks, what power there is in slowness, in choosing to wait, not to freeze but to gather, to sense, to know. Like a sword that waits in its sheath, you know it's there. Others sense it too, and its presence alone changes the temperature of the room. So the question becomes, what would shift in your life if your stillness was no longer hesitation, but readiness? If silence wasn't a blank space, but a charged pause? If non-action wasn't indecision, but mastery? Each time you do not rise to bait, do not echo noise, do not fan the fire, you are cutting through karma, breaking cycles, wielding stillness like a blade. It doesn't need to be seen to be known. That's the nature of true power. It speaks in absence. It works in silence. It acts without show. You become the one who doesn't need to raise your voice to be heard. The one whose restraint speaks louder than any retort. The one whose presence is felt, not because it demands attention, but because it holds attention without force. This is not withdrawal, it is command, subtle, sovereign. And perhaps this is what the old teachers meant all along, that the deepest mastery is not in how well you fight, but in how easily you no longer need to. The sword stays in its scabbard, the silence stands in its place, and yet everything changes. They say that the loudest man in the room is often the weakest, but in Zen, the strongest figure in any space is the one who moves least. Not from rigidity, but from fullness. Not out of fear, but from total presence. There is a kind of power that radiates without motion. It does not clamor. It does not gesture. It does not seek attention. In Zen, this is mastery. So still it becomes invisible. So complete it leaves no trace. A story is told of Taekwondo Su, the great Zen master and sword instructor to samurai. One day, a young warrior asked him, "Master, what is the highest form of swordsmanship?" Taekwondo, with his usual quiet smile, replied, "The highest skill is to never unsheathe the sword, to so thoroughly master your own mind that no threat can disturb it, no insult can find purchase." The student didn't understand. No sword, no duel, no victory. But that is precisely the point. When the mind is not moved, the world cannot control it. And when the world cannot control you, there is nothing to defend. The essence of Zen mastery lies not in doing, but in undoing until only what is essential remains. And often that essence is stillness. Consider the old Zen koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping? On the surface, it confounds, but it is not meant to be solved with logic. It is meant to bring the mind to a halt, to silence the inner chatter, to show the practitioner that truth at its deepest emerges not through answers, but through presence. To live this way, to master the moment without touching it, is to walk through fire without burning, to meet anger without inheriting it, and it requires a power that is far more difficult than any outward show, the power to not be pulled. Not by praise, not by insult, not by the seductive call to react. The Zen masters practice this in every breath, in the tea ceremony, in the stroke of a brush, in the placement of a rock, each action stripped of flourish, yet alive with intention. Each silence a mirror that exposed the nature of the observer. You begin to notice it if you've ever sat with a Zen teacher. They do not rush to fill the silence. They let it swell, they let it burn, they let it work. And in that space, where others might scramble for words they see, they know this is not aloofness, it is discipline. To remain unmoved is not to be uncaring, it is to be free. Free from the compulsions of the ego, from the theater of reaction. The sword you do not draw is not passive. It is the most active form of mastery. It says, I do not need to dominate this moment, because I am the moment. There is no distance between what I feel and what I choose. I have become the center. In Japanese Zen, there's a term, fudge-shin, the immovable mind. It does not mean stiff or frozen, it means deeply rooted, grounded like a mountain, fluid like still water. It is the mind that meets the world not with resistance, but with presence so full there is nothing left to protect. This is not easy, it is a lifelong art, to not flinch, to not rush to answer, to not prove. The world is addicted to motion, to opinion, to performance. So when you do not join the dance, when you simply sit, clear and steady, it unsettles. But that is precisely when the transformation begins. You no longer need to win arguments. You no longer need to be heard over the noise. Your presence becomes your voice. Your stillness becomes your stance. And like the master who need not lift his blade, your power lies not in demonstration, but in restraint. In the deepest moments of practice, the Zen masters say, even the concept of self disappears. There is no me meditating. There is just sitting, just breath, just awareness in that space. Silence is not absence. It is not lack. It is wholeness, nothing missing, nothing extra. And when you return from that place, even to a busy street, even to a tense meeting, even to a confrontation, you carry that clarity with you. Others may shout, others may posture, but you see through it, not cynically, but compassionately. Because you've met your own noise, you've sat with it, and now it has nothing on you. This is the sword you carry, the one no one can see, the one that cuts through illusion, not flesh, that slices through conflict, not conversation, that protects not by threatening, but by being untouched. Mastery, then, is not what you do, it is what you withhold. It is the quiet confidence that does not seek credit, the deep knowing that does not need to display. The world may never applaud you for it, but that's how you'll know it's real, because real power does not need to be seen. There is a legend told in hushed tones beneath the paper lanterns of Kyoto, a story not of battles won or temples built, but of a man who moved so little, the world began to move around him. The man was Master D-Gen, founder of the Sut School of Zen. In his later years, he would often sit for hours in the monastery courtyard, motionless, wordless, not in trance, but in total receptivity. One day, a young novice asked him, "Why do you sit so long without teaching?" D-Gen opened his eyes and whispered, "Because the mountain does not climb itself to speak to the cloud. What can move less than a mountain, yet reshape rivers with its stillness? We are taught to speak, to respond, to act. From childhood, we are trained to chase applause with action. But the Zen masters, in their fierce gentleness, reverse this law. The less you move, the more you see. The less you say, the more is revealed. In the Zendo, the hall of meditation, there is no clapping, no affirmations, no rallying cry, just breath, just the sound of wind against wooden beams. And through that radical simplicity, something ancient stirs. The beginner resists. Silence feels like nothing, like absence, like failure. But if one remains, if one truly stays, the absence begins to take form. The silence becomes a mirror, and the mirror begins to show you you. This is why Zen teaches shikantaza, just sitting, no goal, no text driving, just pure attention, the very antithesis of productivity. And yet, paradoxically, it is in this non-doing that the most profound inner movement begins. To the untrained eye, it is inactivity. To the master, it is the forging of steel. There is a koan that asks, when the flag flaps in the wind, what moves? The flag, the wind. A student answers, both. The master replies, no. Your mind is what moves. To master stillness is not to escape motion. It is to see where the motion actually lives, not in the world, but in the mind. And when the mind stills, the entire world calms. The Zen master is not trying to impress, not trying to dominate, not trying to correct or advise. They do not operate in the arena of ego. Their strength is not in their words, but in their silence, which calls forth your own. Even in dialogue, they teach through subtraction. A student asks, what is the way? The master replies, the cypress tree in the courtyard. Another student, frustrated by silence, pleads, please give me the answer. The master simply closes his eyes. What you interpret in that gesture, that is your answer. Zen is not ornamental. It does not decorate. It strips. It removes the scaffolding of false power until only essence remains. This is why a master's gesture, a single glance, a raised eyebrow, can speak volumes more than a monologue, because it arises not from intellect but from being. Think of the swordsmith hammering steel. Not every strike is visible. Some are made in the shaping of silence. The pause between hits is as important as the contact itself. Too much force without stillness, and the blade becomes brittle. So it is with us. If we react to every disturbance, if we swing at every shadow, we exhaust our edge. But if we wait, observe, withhold, we conserve power, sharpen it, refine it. Mastery, then, is not about intervention, it is about precision. The master does not enter every battle. They wait, not out of hesitation, but out of knowing the moment will arrive. And when it does, stillness moves first. There is an old saying in Zen, when the archer is truly still, the target comes to him. In this world, overstimulated, reactionary, desperate for attention, stillness has become rebellion. To not flinch is an act of courage. To not reply is an act of sovereignty. To be unmoved is to reclaim what was always yours, the seat at the center of your own consciousness. What is the lesson from the Zen masters? Do not rush to show your strength. Become so steady others feel it in your silence. Speak only when the words come from the wellspring, not the storm. And when you sit like a mountain, so the world must rise to meet you. In stillness there is no panic. In stillness there is no proving. In stillness there is no enemy. There is only the blade you did not need to draw. There is a kind of listening that doesn't happen with the ears. You've felt it before, perhaps in a room where a single glance passed between two people said more than an hour's worth of conversation, or in a meeting where laughter felt forced, yet no one dared name the tension that curled underneath the table like smoke. Or maybe in a quiet kitchen when someone you love said, "I'm fine," and the stillness afterward told you everything you needed to know. This is the domain of silence, not as absence, but as presence amplified, a presence that perceives what language cannot carry. In Buddhist philosophy, this is not merely intuition. It is awareness unclouded by self, perception purified through stillness. You are no longer trying to interpret the room. You are letting the room speak through you. The first step is restraint, not leaping in with comment or correction, not filling the air to manage discomfort, just waiting. And it is here, precisely here, where the ordinary person begins to feel restlessness rise. Silence in social spaces often brings anxiety. We think it signals awkwardness, failure, danger, but this is conditioning. The ego, addicted to sound and validation, recoils when it cannot assert or perform. It mistakes emptiness for threat. But the practitioner, the seeker, the watcher, discovers something different. Silence is not a void, it is a vessel. When you sit in a room and say nothing, do nothing, you begin to notice not less, but more. A flicker in someone's eyes, a hesitation in their breathing, the subtle timing between spoken words, microfractures in tone, glimpses of what is guarded, camouflaged, unsaid. This is the unseen language of energy. Zen master the Agitation once wrote, "When you love someone, the best thing you can offer is your presence. How can you love if you are not there?" But presence, real presence, requires you to become exquisitely still, not passive, but deeply tuned, like a bowl of water so calm it reflects the moon. And this reflection, this capacity to perceive others without distortion, begins not in analysis, but in inward quietude. It is said that the Buddha, when approached with questions he deemed unanswerable, would remain completely silent. This silence was not evasion, it was clarity. The Buddha understood that some questions emerge from noise, not need. That words, if misused, can wrap illusion in logic. By saying nothing, he invited the questioner to listen, not to him, but to themselves. There is immense power in this discipline, to withhold not out of fear, but out of depth, to read a room not by controlling it, but by being the most unmoving presence inside it. Think of a still pond in the midst of wind. While the trees thrash and grasses bend, the pond reflects everything clearly. It is not superior, it is simply undisturbed. In contrast, the noisy mind creates ripples that distort what it sees. It projects. It interprets through the veil of its own drama. It hears what it wants to hear, but the silent mind listens with its whole body. It does not intrude, it receives. There is a Japanese concept, the space between things. Not just negative space, but meaningful pause. The silence between notes that creates music. The breath between thoughts that creates insight. To truly read the room, you must dwell in Ma. You must tune yourself to its frequency, where nothing is said and everything is revealed. A story from the Zen tradition. A student asks his master, "How can I better understand the people around me?" The master pours tea, fills the student's cup to the brim, and keeps pouring. The tea spills over, soaking the table. The student gasps. The master says, "How can you receive others when you are already overflowing with yourself?" To read others through silence, you must first empty your own cup. This is the discipline of the inner chamber. You do not speak to prove insight. You do not move to be noticed. You become like a quiet alcove in a temple, empty enough to hold what others cannot say aloud, and slowly people will sense it. In your presence, they will feel seen without being watched, heard without being interrogated, understood without being explained, because silence listens without trying to fix. And the deepest healing often begins when we are simply met by someone who holds a space vast enough to include our unspoken truths. This is not passivity, it is mastery. You are not withdrawing, you are watching. You are not escaping, you are perceiving. And in this presence, rooted and restrained, you begin to see what most miss, that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control, that the truest dynamics live in the unvoiced, that your stillness, owned and held, becomes the clearest signal in a room full of noise. Silence then is not retreat, it is radar. It locates the dissonance, it traces the tension, it reveals the hidden question beneath the spoken answer, and it does so not by confronting, but by witnessing, fully, steadily, without fear. This is your superpower. Not to dominate, but to discern. Not to impress, but to invite. Not to add noise, but to become the echo chamber's opposite, the empty room, where truth reverberates with nowhere to hide. So the next time you enter a conversation, a conflict, a gathering, pause. Feel the weight of your presence settle in your spine. Resist the compulsion to fill the air. Just be, watch, wait, and then listen not to the words, but to the silence around them. That is where everything lives. There is a silence deeper than the absence of words. It doesn't begin when people stop speaking. It begins when you stop needing them to. It begins when your attention becomes so still, so undemanding, that it ceases to seek and begins to receive. In the inner chamber of every moment, beneath the language, beneath the posture, beneath the curated expressions, we find an unspoken climate. It is made of micro-hesitations, unclaimed truths, suppressed tensions, and longings no one dares give voice to. Most of us pass through these spaces unaware, attuned only to what is said. But the one who has mastered silence reads what is not. They don't just hear, they perceive. Silence sharpens perception, not like a blade, but like still water, transparent, reflective, yielding. It allows you to feel the room, not dissect it. You don't invade anyone's privacy. You simply stop projecting your own noise, and so everything else becomes clearer. Have you noticed how, in moments of quiet discomfort, people rush to speak, to apologize, to explain, to joke, to fill the emptiness with something digestible? But the adept, the one anchored in silence, does not rush. They wait, and in that waiting the truth reveals itself. A story from the life of a Japanese tea master. Senno Rikiya, a warrior, once came to challenge him, not with a sword, but with presence. He sat across from Rikit, stiff and proud, trying to provoke. Rikit served tea with graceful stillness, saying nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally the warrior cracked. "Are you mocking me with this silence?" he demanded. Riki looked up softly. "Only if you brought mockery into the room." The silence had become a mirror, and the warrior saw himself in it. To listen to the unsaid is to let others encounter themselves in your stillness. You do not interpret. You do not interrupt. You simply offer a space where words are no longer the dominant medium of communication. A space where energy, intention, and emotion are felt directly. In many Buddhist temples, conversations happen as much in bowing, in breath, in gaze, as in words. Monks do not fill the air with interpretation. They cultivate the presence to dwell with what is. To read the air, koki wo yomu, as the Japanese say, is to feel the communal rhythm beneath the individual expression. It is not mind reading, it is attunement. This attunement begins with surrender. You cannot listen to the room if you are trying to manage it. You cannot read what is unsaid if you are still clinging to the next clever response you wish to say. You must lay down your armor, your expertise, your inner commentator, and instead widen. Listen not to reply, listen to dissolve. And what you find again and again is this: people want to be known in the silence. They crave it. The eyes say what the mouth cannot. The body shifts in small betrayals of truth. The timing between sentences reveals the fear beneath the surface. And still, the world rushes past. But you, if you remain, if you resist the pull to interrupt or improve or solve, you offer something revolutionary. You offer sanctuary. In the stillness of your attention, others begin to reveal themselves, not because you demanded it, but because your presence did not threaten it. This is the paradox of silence. It holds more conversation than noise ever can. When you read the room through silence, you start to see not just people's words, but their patterns. You begin to feel when someone is speaking from ego or from essence, when they're performing or pleading, when they need to be heard, or when they need you to hold a space where even that need can fall away. In the sutras, the Buddha often responded to chaos with silence, not because he lacked answers, but because he knew that the most skillful action was sometimes non-action. The room would pulse with tension, argument, politics, and he would sit. And gradually, the stillness would reshape the room itself, like gravity. Try it. Next time you feel the storm in a room, anger, gossip, anxiety, don't join it. Don't flee it. Become the calm at the eye. Withdraw not your attention, but your reaction. Let your stillness speak. I will not amplify this noise. You will find people drawn to you, not for answers, but for refuge. And eventually, some will begin to ask, "What are you doing differently?" You'll know, but you won't need to explain. The answer is not in your words. It's in the way you wait, the way you breathe, the way you see without demanding to be seen. And this is the final gift. When you master the silence in the room, you discover not only others more clearly, but yourself. You see your own habits of noise, your subtle defenses, your cravings for recognition. And when you can see those without judging them, without feeding them, you begin to move differently. You no longer enter a space asking, "How can I control this?" You begin to ask, "What is this space already saying? If I would only listen." And in that shift, you stop managing perception and start participating in presence. The difference is immense, because true power does not seek to fill. It makes space. It is not the voice dominating the table. It is the silence that holds the table together. And once you feel that, once you realize that your quiet awareness can change the very architecture of a room, then you begin to walk through the world like a temple walks through a forest, still rooted, alive, listening. The room was empty. No voices, no movement, no story playing out. Just the faint hush of air moving over walls. The kind of space people walk into and immediately feel the urge to fill, with music, small talk, a phone call, a sigh, anything. Because emptiness unsettles, silence unmasks. But linger long enough and the room begins to speak. It doesn't use words. It speaks in the tone of the walls, the gravity of dust undisturbed, the mood of light cast across the floor. It speaks in absence, and if you are quiet, truly quiet, you will hear what was left behind. This is not imagination. It is presence so attuned that it becomes a receiver. Monks have said it for centuries. The room remembers. The chair remembers who once waited in it. The floor remembers the weight of unspoken grief. The air carries the residue of anger, or the echo of laughter long gone. Silence is not just a lack of sound. It is the reappearance of everything that noise conceals. And so, when you walk into a room and feel something, but nothing's happened, know that silence is telling the truth most voices cannot bear. The mind wants to solve, the ego wants to manage, but the soul, if you allow it, wants only to listen. And when it listens, it finds something startling. The empty room is never empty. A Zen koan tells of a student who asked his master, "What is the way?" The master said, "The empty room." The student frowned, waiting for more. The master only bowed, then left the room. The student sat in confusion, until, slowly, he noticed the heat of his own restlessness, the weight of his expectations, the hum of the present moment, louder than his thoughts. That day, the silence became his first teacher. We think of revelation as thunder, but sometimes it arrives as a pause so profound it reorders your entire orientation to reality. Ask yourself, why are we so afraid of rooms without noise? Why do we enter them fidgeting with our phones, turning on music, calling out as if to prove we're not alone? Because silence confronts us, not with danger, but with clarity. And clarity at first can feel like loss. When all distraction is gone, we see, without distortion, what is here, what we carry, what we try to hide beneath words. But there is freedom in this seeing. In silence, we begin to notice our own emotional architecture. We feel how tension rises in the body without any external cause. We see the mind's compulsions to dramatize, control, or escape, and we begin, gently, to disarm them. This is why Buddhist temples are built like open vessels. They are not cluttered, not ornate. They are intentionally spacious, because space reveals what is essential. The silence in these rooms doesn't suppress energy, it refines it. And here's the paradox. When we stop grasping for what is absent, the emptiness itself becomes full. The empty room begins to teach us not just about itself, but about how we carry space within us. Are you a room others can enter without fear? Are you a space where truth doesn't need to shout? Are you empty enough, still enough, for someone to finally hear their own heart when they speak in your presence. Silence makes you that space. The ego believes it must speak first, prove itself, assert dominance. But true presence begins not with projection, but with receptivity. Not with performance, but with stillness. And that's the quiet revolution hidden in the empty room. It reconditions us to be radically available. Not reactive, not absent, but available to nuance, to truth, to life as it is, unedited. To sit in an empty room and remain, without reaching for distraction, is to begin the journey home. You are not there to manipulate the silence. You are there to be rearranged by it. Because silence, like water, dissolves what is not real. It breaks the illusion that you must fill every moment with meaning. And in its patience, it reveals a deeper rhythm. One that waits, watches, and speaks only when the words are as clear as the stillness that bore them. So the next time you enter a quiet space, do not rush to fill it. Breathe, listen, let it shape you. Because the empty room is never empty. It's simply waiting for someone still enough to hear what's already there. It begins with a quiet so sudden it feels like a slap. You've just stopped speaking, mid-sentence perhaps, or chosen not to reply to a cutting remark. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't defend. You didn't perform. The room doesn't understand. The conversation doesn't know what to do with your pause. And inside you, something begins to squirm. This is the moment, the turning. When silence confronts the ego, it is not a gentle caress. It is a mirror held so still, so close, that even the smallest distortions of self begin to tremble. The ego thrives on narrative. It feeds on noise, identity reaffirmed through repetition, praise, resistance, argument. Applause to the ego, silence is starvation. So when you stop reacting, when you offer no opinion, no apology, no justification, the ego panics. But here's the secret: Buddhist masters have long understood that panic is the sound of a false self dying. In a monastery tucked deep in the Japanese mountains, a Zen novice was once tasked with sweeping the meditation hall. As he swept, he hummed softly to himself. The master passed by. He did not speak, only looked. The novice paused. The master walked on. The next day, the novice swept in silence. But inwardly, he narrated his progress, his discipline, his pride. Again, the master passed. And again, only silence. It took him weeks to understand that the sweeping was not the task. The silence was, and the real dirt to be cleared wasn't on the floor. It was in the mind. When silence confronts the ego, it does not humiliate. It humbles. But in doing so, it hands you something far more precious than pride: clarity. You begin to see all the small ways the ego tries to assert itself. The tightness in the chest when you're not acknowledged. The itch to prove your point. The storm that rises when someone misunderstands you. All of these are invitations to react. But silence does not RSVP. It watches, it feels, it breathes. In the face of silence, others often project. They'll mistake it for indifference, weakness, confusion. But that is not your concern. Your silence is not a void. It is a vessel. And what it holds is power, not of control, but of containment. Not of winning, but of witnessing. To sit in a room, especially in conflict, and remain grounded in silence. This is not passivity. It is presence at its sharpest edge. The stillness of a blade that cuts without drawing. The eye of the storm. There's an old parable told by the Vietnamese monk, Thi Che H Tun H. A young man approaches the Buddha, angry, shouting insults. The Buddha remains silent. After several moments, the man stops, disarmed. "Why don't you respond?" he demands. The Buddha answers, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man is stunned. The insult never landed. That is the sword of silence, not swung but shown, not used to injure but to end the cycle. The ego is always ready for war, but silence withdraws from the battlefield, not out of fear, but because it recognizes the terrain as illusion. This is the confrontation no one prepares us for. not the noise from others, but the riot within ourselves when we choose not to react. And yet, with each moment of restraint, something ancient awakens, something deeper than pride, stronger than certainty. It is the part of you that does not need to win. It does not need to speak to be seen. It does not chase validation like water in a sieve. It waits, it watches, it simply is. And in that still presence, you begin to realize you are no longer performing the self. You are embodying it. In that turning, something falls away. The constant need to explain, the hunger to be understood, the fear of being forgotten. What remains is not hollow, spacious, alive. And into that space, truth can finally enter, not shouted, not demanded, but known. So let the ego flinch. Let it twitch and tighten and tug at your tongue. Let it whisper all the things you could say, and let them go. Because what silence gives you, noise could never keep. And yet, even when you choose silence consciously, knowing its strength, knowing its spaciousness, the ego finds a way to slip back in. Through the back door of righteousness. I was silent, it says, and that makes me better than them. But that too is noise. Silence is not a mask the ego can wear. It is the space where masks fall away. It is not a strategy. It is a surrender, and this is why so few are willing to stay in it for long. Because in that stillness, there is no applause, no narrative, no guarantee that you will be seen, understood, or rewarded. What is revealed instead is you, unadorned, untethered, unrehearsed, the self beneath the stories. This is the second confrontation. The first was the outer ego, the one that flares and performs and corrects others. But this is the subtler one, the one that whispers, you are your silence. That craves spiritual superiority, that clings to stillness the way it once clung to speech. But Buddhist teachings offer a subtler truth. Even silence must be emptied of identity. In the ancient text of the Shurangama Sutra, the Buddha challenges his disciple Ananda. When the mouth is closed and no words are spoken, is that silence? Ananda replies, yes. The Buddha says, then the stone outside the gate is the greatest sage. It has never spoken. This is the trap, confusing non-speaking with awakening. True silence isn't the absence of words, it's the absence of self-clinging, so we go deeper. There's a koan from the Zen tradition. A student asks the master, what is the path? The master replies, everyday life is the path. The student presses, but how do I follow it? The master says, if you try to follow it, you go away from it. Likewise, if you try to be silent as a method to become something, a better version of yourself, a wiser presence in the room, you've already left the path. Silence is not a behavior. It is an atmosphere. You do not wear it. You let it wear you. And in that surrender, you start to hear what silence is really saying, not in language, in sensation, in intuition. In the gentle shifting of perception from the foreground to the background, you notice how your chest softens when you no longer have to protect your image. You notice how the grip of anticipation loosens when you're not preparing a comeback. You notice how, in not reacting, you become available to everything. There's a profound moment in the life of Milarepa, the Tibetan yogi and poet saint. After years of deep solitude, he re-enters the world. A man mocks him, spits near his feet, tries to provoke him. Milarepa does not flinch. He simply smiles, and in that smile the man falls to his knees. What broke him was not force. It was the silence behind the smile, the presence that did not mirror his aggression. Milarepa had no ego left to injure, and that was his freedom. This is the turning that silence brings, not the turning of the world, but the turning of the self, away from the endless orbit of identity and into the gravitless center of being. You become less interested in winning, less drawn to proving, less entangled in what others see or say, and more attuned to what is true before truth is named, what is felt before it is formed, what simply is. This is not retreat. It is arrival. It is the return to a self that does not react because it does not need to, a self that does not speak because it is listening to something deeper than words, a self that is no longer centered in ego, but in awareness. When silence confronts the ego, what begins as tension becomes transmutation. The noise dissolves, the need evaporates, and what remains is a presence so full, so still, so luminous. It becomes a kind of light no one can look away from, even though it makes no sound. There is a quiet moment, so brief it might pass unnoticed, when a person pauses just before answering an insult, just before rising to defend their point in a heated debate, just before proving they were right again. That moment, invisible and weightless, holds the power to reshape a life. We've been taught, almost from birth, that to let something go unchallenged is to lose, that to walk away without the last word is surrender, that silence in the face of confrontation is weakness. But Buddhist philosophy offers an uncomfortable truth. It is not the need to win that reveals your strength, but your willingness to let go of the game entirely. To surrender the need to win is not defeat, it is transcendence. Consider this: what is winning if not a desire to validate the self? And what is that desire if not the ego reaching out, grasping for form, for identity, for solidity? The need to win, in arguments, in status, in being seen as right, is the ego's last stand. It is its cry of, I am here and I must matter. But silence, true silence, does not need to matter. It already is. In one Zen parable, two monks are arguing about a flag fluttering in the wind. One says the flag is moving. The other insists it's the wind that moves. A passing Zen master hears them and says, it is not the flag, it is not the wind, it is your mind that moves. And just like that, the argument collapses. Not because a victor was declared, but because the very premise of winning was dissolved. This is the turning, the moment when you begin to notice that every desire to win carries with it a tension, a narrowing of vision, a tightening in the chest. And that, by contrast, surrender opens. You begin to feel it, not intellectually but viscerally, how every act of letting go leaves behind a kind of luminosity, like moonlight on still water, not empty but vast, not weak but boundless. To surrender the need to win is to drop the sword before the duel begins, not because you are afraid of the fight, but because you have nothing to defend. In this way, silence is not the absence of battle, it is the absence of battleground. This is the heart of the mandala's turning, the ring where struggle meets spaciousness, where the storm of proving begins to dissolve into presence. And in this ring, you do not defeat your opponent, you stop needing one. There's a Japanese concept, mashin, meaning no mind. It is the clarity that arises when the mind is unclouded by grasping, expectation, or strategy. In this state, there is no calculation, no narrative, no need to manipulate the moment toward a preferred outcome. Only presence, fluid, silent, and utterly unshakable. Imagine the next time you're misunderstood. Someone twists your words, challenges your intent, and instead of defending, correcting, retaliating, you breathe, you pause. You allow their version to pass through you like wind through bamboo, not out of avoidance, but out of mastery. Not reacting does not mean you are passive. It means you are precise. The ego wants to win because it fears erasure, but presence cannot be erased. It exists whether seen or unseen, heard or unheard. In silence, we practice not disappearing, but becoming ungraspable, like the sky too vast to be held, like a mirror that reflects everything but clings to nothing. It's tempting to ask, if I surrender the need to win, do I risk being taken advantage of? Do I risk being misunderstood? Yes, but ask a deeper question. What do you lose by clinging to the need to be understood? What do you sacrifice in peace, in clarity, in your own sovereignty, just to be right? Winning may bring a moment of triumph, but surrender brings a lifetime of stillness. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a saying, Let the world have its way with you and remain whole. This is not resignation. It is strength drawn from the depths of a presence so unwavering it no longer fears the tides. It simply lets them rise and fall, while the ocean floor remains undisturbed. When you surrender the need to win, something else rises in its place. Vision. You begin to see how often our battles are ghosts, projections of unmet needs, unhealed wounds, old stories repeating themselves in louder and louder loops. Silence doesn't fix them, but it no longer feeds them. And in the absence of fuel, the fire goes out. From this stillness, a new power emerges, not to dominate, not to escape, but to remain, to hold your ground without noise, to walk away without drama, to choose your energy like a master chooses his sword, rarely and only when necessary. This surrender is not the end of power, it is its beginning, because the one who no longer needs to win has already won. A man once stood in the middle of a crowded marketplace, utterly still. He was not preaching, not performing, not even watching. He was simply present. The bustle around him swirled like weather. Voices rising, coins clinking, merchants calling out. But the man remained unmoved, eyes lowered, hands folded at his center. Some laughed at him, others ignored him. But a few stopped, paused, and for reasons they couldn't quite explain, they too became still. Something about his silence seemed to ripple through the noise, not as resistance, not as judgment, but as presence so dense it had its own gravity. This is not myth. This is power, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that transforms attention itself. Presence that doesn't need to control the moment, because it is the moment. In Buddhist philosophy, this is known as tathata, suchness, the unadorned, unspectacular truth of what is, pure being free of commentary. And it is from this radiant stillness that true mastery is born. But here is the paradox: presence is silent, and silence to the untrained mind appears as emptiness, or worse, as vulnerability. That is the illusion. In reality, silence is so full it spills over the edges of experience. It is what allows you to see without grasping, to hear without defending, to be without needing to declare yourself. It is the sword you never draw, because your stillness has already dissolved the need for violence. There is a teaching from the Zen tradition, the sound of one hand clapping. It's a koan, a riddle meant to break the mind from its habits. The answer is not spoken, it is felt, like the truth of silence itself. Not a gap in conversation, but a presence beyond language. When you are rooted in that presence, you are no longer merely responding to life. You are meeting it, unarmored, awake. Think of a moment, perhaps a recent one, when you were with someone who was fully there, not distracted, not planning their reply, just listening. Not merely with their ears, but with their entire being. Now remember how seen you felt, how safe, how real. That's the power of presence. It doesn't overpower, it allows. And in allowing, it changes everything. There's a story told in the early Buddhist sutras of a man named Angulimala, a bandit and killer, known for wearing a garland of fingers taken from his victims. When the Buddha approached him, Angulimala ran toward him, blade in hand. But the Buddha didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood, silently, in perfect stillness, and something extraordinary happened. Angulimala stopped. He couldn't move. His violence met a silence so total, so unwavering, it had no mirror to reflect itself in. The chaos within him dissolved into the stillness before him, and in that space his life began again. This is not fantasy. This is physics of the inner world, because presence absorbs aggression. Like water receiving fire, it does not react. It transforms. And this transformation is not passive. It is a force. The kind of force that doesn't impose but awakens. The kind that disarms without conflict, simply by refusing to feed the flame. This is how silence masters the moment. Not by waiting for the right time to speak, but by being the right time. A calm gaze, a pause before answering, a breath instead of a retort. These are not tricks of influence. They are thresholds, openings into deeper layers of reality where you no longer need to handle the moment because you are the ground on which the moment rests. In these moments you stop performing and you start radiating. Presence is not charisma. It is not about capturing attention, but releasing it so that everyone in your orbit becomes more themselves. In your silence, they hear themselves more clearly. In your stillness, their spinning slows. This is the hidden generosity of silence. It gives others back to themselves. And this is why presence masters, not because it dominates, but because it frees. In the echo chamber of modern life, where reaction is currency and noise is rewarded, to sit in stillness is a rebellion, but a gentle one, a fragrant one, like incense drifting through a concrete room, reminding the air that it too can soften. We spend so much energy trying to take control of situations, trying to steer conversations, fix perceptions, outsmart opponents, rescue our self-image. But in doing so, we miss the deeper opportunity to become the space in which none of that is needed. Imagine walking into a high-stakes meeting or a painful conversation with someone you love, or even into your own spiraling thoughts, not with armor, but with presence, not with a strategy, but with silence. Imagine what shifts, not because you're playing a better game, but because you've stopped playing altogether. The moment you cease grasping at control, the world begins to soften in your hands, not always immediately, not always visibly, but slowly, steadily, like ice melting in a bowl you forgot you were holding. And there you are, not victorious, not defeated, just present. And in that presence, everything changes. It happens rarely, but when it does, you never forget it. A moment when the world, buzzing, scrolling, demanding, suddenly pauses. Not because you stopped speaking, but because you stopped needing to speak. You're in a room, maybe a meeting, a gathering, maybe even a confrontation. There's tension in the air, words volleyed like arrows, people subtly posturing for control. And then, without drama or declaration, you withdraw not outwardly, but inwardly, into stillness. You do nothing flamboyant. You don't interrupt or silence others. You simply refuse to participate in the noise. You soften your face. You return to your breath. You anchor your awareness like a mountain sinking into the earth, and something astonishing happens. The energy in the room shifts, slightly at first. Someone lowers their voice. Another becomes aware of how fast they were speaking. One person begins to wonder why they were posturing to begin with. And without a word from you, the situation cools, not resolves necessarily, but softens, as if time itself took a breath with you. This is not magic. This is the subtle contagion of presence, because presence does not belong to the person who possesses it. It ripples, it transmits, it enters a chaotic system like water poured into fire, not by fighting flames, but by reminding everything around it what quiet feels like. The Zen masters spoke of this not as performance, but as inevitability. When one person in the room is truly still, the world cannot help but feel it. We're taught that influence is a game of speech, how to persuade, negotiate, win. But real influence often begins in what is not said, in the wordless transmission of being fully here, not reaching, not defending, just being. There's a story from the Buddhist tradition of a young student who asked his teacher, "What is the most important teaching?" The master simply stood, picked up a teacup, and placed it back down. No explanation, no parable, just presence. The student didn't understand, not then, but the memory of that silent gesture stayed with him. Years later, it bloomed. He understood. The master's presence was the teaching, not the cup, not the act, but the silence behind it, the pause that revealed the space where insight arises unforced. This is what happens when the world pauses with you. It is not obedience, it is resonance. It's what you feel when a forest holds its breath as you walk alone among the trees, or when you sit beside someone grieving and say nothing, and somehow your silence says everything. These moments are not planned. They cannot be manufactured, but they can be invited through discipline, through awareness, through the sacred restraint that lets go of performance and returns to essence. And what is that essence? The still point, the quiet center, the one who no longer reaches to grasp the moment, but holds it with reverence. In a society engineered for attention, the deepest rebellion is not to capture attention, but to offer sanctuary from it, to be a pause in the noise, a space in the sentence, a stillness others can enter without fear of being judged, edited, or reshaped. And when they do, they feel it. They may not say anything, often they won't, but something will change in their tone, in their posture, in the way they begin to listen, not just to you, but to themselves. Because in your silence, they hear something beneath their own inner dialogue. In your stillness, they catch a glimpse of the part of themselves that isn't anxious, isn't trying, isn't proving. This is what it means to lead from silence, not to dominate, but to deepen, not to control, but to center. And sometimes when you are fully rooted in presence, something even more mysterious occurs. The moment begins to shape itself around that stillness. Conversations unfold more gently. Decisions arise with less friction. Conflict meets fewer openings to escalate. The world briefly moves at the speed of being. This is not a skill. It is not a tactic. It is the byproduct of living from your depth, again and again, until your presence no longer needs to announce itself. It simply is. And in being, it retunes everything it touches. So what happens when the world pauses with you? It remembers itself. It steps back from the cliff edge of speed and urgency and returns, however briefly, to the temple of now. And in that temple, there is no need to speak to be heard, no need to move to have impact. Just the vast, radiant stillness of your awareness, like a candle in a storm that doesn't flicker, because it's not fighting the wind, it simply is. You come with questions, a mind sharpened like a blade, honed on podcasts and arguments, trained to cut through ambiguity, to demand clarity, conclusion, proof. You sit before the old monk and ask, what is the key? How do I win? How do I master this moment? He says nothing. Not because he doesn't understand you, but because he does. His silence is not passive. It is not empty. It is a gate you do not know how to open, because you keep trying to knock with words. In Zen, this is the final cone. Not a riddle to be solved, a boundary to be dissolved. There is a moment in every seeker's journey when answers stop arriving in language. They arrive in stillness. The way rain doesn't explain itself, but soaks you anyway. The way a mountain doesn't speak, but silences everything that climbs it. You were looking for technique. Instead, you found the void. And at first, it terrifies. There is a kind of ego death that comes when we realize the mind, clever, analytical, ceaselessly active, cannot cross the final threshold, not because it is weak, but because it was never meant to lead. Presence was. The final cone is not a puzzle, but a mirror. It reflects not a trick answer, but your inability to stop asking, to stop needing, to stop. This is where silence stops being an absence and begins to burn. Think of the teacher Bodhidharma, the bearded figure who brought Zen from India to China, who sat facing a wall for 9 years in unshakable stillness. A student came to him, begging for wisdom. Bodhidharma refused to speak. The student, desperate to prove his sincerity, finally cut off his own arm as an offering. Then Bodhidharma replied, "Why this violence? Why this extremity? Not to glorify pain, but to show how strong the ego's grasp is and how much it resists the surrender required to receive what silence offers. Not information, not certainty, but awakening. The answers silence gives are not what the ego wants. They do not validate its opinions. They do not confirm superiority. They do not soothe identity, they break it. You are not who you think you are. That's what silence keeps whispering, not cruelly, but truthfully. And then what? Then, if you stay, if you really stay, not just with your body, but with your full attention, uncloaked by performance or defense, silence begins to teach. First, it shows you your fear, the fear of disappearing, of not mattering, of not being special. Then, it shows you the one who watches the fear. And finally, it shows you there is no separation. The watcher, the fear, the silence, all one. This cannot be said. It can only be sat with. And that's the revelation, that the question you brought, how do I master this moment, was born of a misunderstanding. You were trying to conquer the ocean with a cup, to scoop stillness into a self, to possess peace, but peace cannot be possessed, only participated in. So silence becomes the ultimate undoing, and also the ultimate answer, not by solving your questions, by dissolving the one who needs them solved. It's like the sound of a bell, not the bell itself, not the air it rings through, but the space after the ring, that shivering pause where something sacred is possible, something the mind can't script. In that space, power returns, but not as dominance, as devotion to presence, to truth, unspoken, to life as it is. The final cone leaves you with no words, and also finally with no need for them. Just the breath, just the room, just the stillness that holds it all. There is a sound beneath all things, not music, not noise, not even silence in the way most think of it, as an absence of disturbance. It is the hum behind existence, the breath behind breath, the deep, patient vibration that sits quietly beneath every word, every action, every storm of the mind, like the still pond that remains, even when the wind dances wildly across its surface. Most never hear it, not because it is rare, but because it is constant, and constancy is easy to ignore. To find it, we do not need to journey outward. We must descend inward, through layers of thought, through habits of speech, through the thicket of identity, until we reach what the ancients called the original face, the self before name, before role, before noise. In Buddhist tradition, this is not just metaphor, it is practice. Monks sit for hours, eyes soft, spine straight, letting the mind unwind itself like a spool. And eventually, not always, but sometimes, a moment arrives when the chatter exhausts itself, and what remains is not silence, but soundless clarity. In that stillness, things are not quiet because nothing is happening. They are quiet because everything is understood. Have you ever noticed how a room changes when someone truly listens? Not listens to reply, not listens to control, but listens with full presence. No urgency, no interruption, no agenda. It's as if the molecules in the air rearrange. Time slows. Truth begins to speak softly, not with sentences, but with sensation. That is the sound beneath all things. It is why a tree unmoving commands reverence. Why a candle in the dark draws eyes without saying a word. Why a newborn child sleeping can bring a room of adults into absolute stillness. Because presence emits its own frequency, and when you match it, the world responds. In one Zen tale, a student asked the master, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" The question was not meant to be solved intellectually. It was a wedge, a device to break the mind's addiction to duality, to name and oppose, to divide the world into this and that. But if you sit with it long enough and let your striving fall away, something shifts. The question stops being external. You stop seeking the sound, or there. You start sensing the sound within. The one hand clapping is not a riddle. It is a mirror. Can you hear the sound of being itself? This is the paradox of the sound beneath all things. It is not added to the world. It has been here all along. But it takes unlearning to perceive it. Children hear it naturally, in the wind through leaves, in the hush before snowfall, in the rhythm of their own breath when they lay awake at night. But as we age, we trade listening for labeling. We swap awe for explanation. until stillness becomes uncomfortable. But if you reverse the exchange, if you trade reaction for receptivity, performance for presence, then suddenly the world slows to meet you, like a lake calming its surface to reflect the sky, and then the sound returns. It may come as peace, or tears, or the feeling that for one brief, bright moment, you are not separate from anything, that you are not watching the universe, you are it. And in that moment, there is nothing to do, no one to prove, no noise to make, you just remain, listening, breathing, being, and the world finally listens back.